welcome to the history of Rome. The Romans enjoyed 10 years of peace after the end of the Latin War in 338 BC, and spent the years quietly expanding their territory. This decade saw the emergence of a new attitude towards territorial expansion. It was no longer enough to merely ensure the survival of Rome by controlling Latium and fending off intruders. The Romans now sought to spread their influence over a much wider geographic area in order to draw taxes and manpower from a wider pool of citizens. No one power had controlled the entire Italian peninsula before, but the Romans started to think that maybe they could pull it off. They essentially looked around Italy, sized up the competition, liked their odds, and went for it. The Samnites were number one on the list of potential threats, and the Romans knew that if they were able to conquer the powerful hill tribe, nothing would stand in their way of conquering all of Italy. However, the Romans were loath to simply expand. That would be immoral. The Romans only engaged in just wars when they or one of their allies was threatened. They would never declare a war unprovoked. It was considered barbaric. So they set about needling the Samnites into attacking first, so Rome could enter the war it wanted honorably. They dispatched citizens to form a colony in Samnite territory, figuring the Samnites would either let them get away with it, and the Romans would have gained more land without drawing swords, or the Samnites would attack, and the Romans would come to the rescue of their besieged citizens. Things did not go exactly by Roman design, but in the end they did get their war. The Samnites were caught up at the time fighting the Greeks in the south and could not immediately respond to the Roman settlement, so the Romans, emboldened, set up another. When the Samnites concluded their war with the Greeks, they did turn west, but it was not to directly engage the Roman colonies. Rather, they moved on the Greek city of Neapolis, which is present-day Naples, forging an agreement with its citizens to aid their dream of expanding off the coast and into Greater Campania. The nobility of Neapolis, however, dismayed at the Samnite garrison and the loss of control over their own city, turned to Rome for assistance. It was the call Rome was looking for, but it was something of a letdown. Fighting the Samnites in Campania would not garner them any more land if they won, which was the whole point of provoking the Samnites. But, reluctant to pass up the opportunity, they agreed to help the Neapolitan nobility and drive off the Samnite garrison, which they did, sparking the Second Samnite War in 327 BC. The early momentum was clearly in Roman hands. Samnite allies were peeled off, and the Romans won victory after victory on the battlefield. In fact, the only major defeat for the Romans in these early years came as a result not of Samnite strength, but of a psychological mutiny by the Roman army against their own commander, the result of an extended melodrama which is too juicy for me to not relate in detail. In 325 BC, as would be the case in many of these years, a dictator, Lucius Papirius Cursor, was appointed to oversee the war effort, and Quintus Fabius Maximus, the grandfather of the more famous Fabius Maximus, who saw Rome through the early disastrous years of the Second Punic War, was named his master of horse. They set out for Samnium, but the taking of the auspices, a critical superstitious step for all Roman endeavors, had been done poorly, or was messed up, or showed ill omens. Whatever was wrong, Papirius decided to head back to Rome and retake them in an attempt to secure a favorable sign from the gods. He very clearly ordered Fabius not to engage the Samnites while he was gone, but Fabius, being young, could not help himself. The Samnites, knowing the Roman commander was away, were relaxed, believing no battle imminent. Fabius, on his own initiative, decided that it would be a perfect time for a sneak attack. He ordered the army out, routing the surprised Samnites easily, and captured their camp, along with a great deal of plunder. When Papirius returned, however, he was enraged, red in the face, screaming and cursing enraged. How could Fabius have so clearly disobeyed him, when the whole purpose for leaving was to align Roman interests with the gods' favor? By attacking before securing favorable auspices, Fabius endangered not just the army, but Rome as a whole. Then, singing the praises of Manlius, who, you will recall, executed his own son for disobedience, Papirius ordered Fabius arrested. The army was incredulous. They had just won an easy victory thanks to Fabius's decisive action, and now Papirius wanted to punish him? It was absurd. The general feeling was that Papirius was simply jealous for missing out on the glory. Despite entreaties from the officers, however, Papirius insisted on Fabius's arrest. A slow-moving riot began to build, which was cut off only by nightfall, and during the night, Fabius, understanding that Papirius had every intention of executing him the next morning, escaped from the camp and made for Rome with all haste. Upon reaching the city, Fabius and his father, who had previously been consul and was a man of high standing, went before the Senate to plead the young man's case. Papirius showed up, and the scene from the camp was repeated. Papirius was a towering inferno of rage. He railed against Fabius's disobedience and sacrilege, and pointed to the irreparable harm the boy had done to army discipline and the moral fiber of the state itself. There was nothing untrue about what Papirius said, but the Senate pleaded with him to go easy on Fabius. He was a popular young noble, and, after all, had just won a great victory. Wasn't Papirius taking this all just a bit too far? By this point Papirius was getting shrill, and I can't help but picture the senators looking sideways at each other as he launched into another red-faced harangue, and thinking, geez man, lighten up. In the end, when it became clear that absolutely no one supported him, Papirius attempted to salvage some dignity, not just for himself, but for the office of dictator, which was in danger of becoming irrelevant. He agreed to lift the sentence of death and content himself with stripping Fabius of his power and leaving him behind in Rome. Returning to the army, Papirius ordered his troops to pursue and engage the reformed Samnite army, but this time, instead of an easy victory, the Samnites managed to get the upper hand. The Roman soldiers, who loved Fabius and hated Papirius, had no intention of letting the dictator win any battles, so they, in effect, threw the fight. Papirius, though, did not ride off into the history books as a shrill and overbearing failure, and to his credit he saw the error of his ways. He had come down too harshly on Fabius, and in doing so had lost the support of his troops. So he spent the next few days endearing himself to them, visiting the wounded and treading lightly with his discipline. He won back the favor of the men, and when he ordered them out to fight the next time, they did not disappoint and delivered to him the victory that he sought. Over the course of the war, Papirius would serve as consul 4 times, and when he finally did ride off into the history books, he was remembered as a great commander and one of the best men of his generation. After Papirius's victory, the Samnites sued for peace, but the Roman Senate demanded such lopsided terms that the Samnites could not accept, and the war continued. It would prove to be a mistake of the highest order, because the Romans were about to walk into one of their greatest and arguably most humiliating defeats in their history. At least at Cannae, the Roman army was beaten in the field, but Caudine Forks ended with the Romans so completely outmaneuvered that their army never drew their swords before offering them to the Samnites in surrender. Many saw it as punishment for the hubris Rome had shown towards the Samnite peace envoys. The defeat at Caudine Forks, however, just as the defeat of Cannae would a century later, did nothing less than prove that the Romans were cut from a completely different cloth than their contemporaries. Any other state, when faced with such catastrophic defeats, would have quit and prayed for mercy from their enemies. But the Romans never even gave it a thought. They never quit. They just kept coming. At Caudine Forks, the Romans were set up perfectly by the Samnite commander, Gaius Pontius. He dispatched some of his soldiers into Roman territory, masquerading as non-combatant herdsmen. When they inevitably fell into the hands of Roman patrols, they all told the same story to their captors. The full force of the Samnite army was besieging the city of Lucaria, a Roman ally. The Romans, hearing this information repeated from multiple sources, bought the story hook, line, and sinker. They sent both consuls with their armies to aid Lucaria, but, of course, the Samnites were nowhere near Lucaria. They were stationed near Caudium, specifically at the pass where the Romans would have to travel to get to Lucaria. Called the Caudine Forks, the pass started very narrow, then opened into a wide plain, and then became very narrow again on the way out. On either side, steep peaks prevented any movement besides forward and backward. The consuls led their army hastily into the pass, believing all the danger to lie ahead. But when they reached the other side of the flat plain, they found their exit blocked off by a pile of boulders. Sensing that something was amiss, The consuls immediately ordered a retreat, but by this time it was too late. The Samnites had already blockaded the other end as well. The Roman army was trapped and in a hopeless position. Soldiers joked darkly about their pointless labor as the consuls ordered them to build a fortified camp. There was no getting out, and there would be no attack to repel. The Samnites would simply wait the requisite 3 days for them to run out of food and demand surrender. The consuls and their officers recognized the immensity of their blunder as they tossed around impossible to execute escape plans. The next morning Pontius sent for his father, who, though retired, was a great military strategist, and asked for the old man's advice about what to do with the trapped Romans. At first his father sent word that Pontius should let the army walk away unharmed. Unsure of the message, for it seemed a crazy notion, Pontius sent for clarification, and when word came again, the message had changed. It now read, "Kill them all, down to the last man." This sounded more like his father, but Pontius was confused and unsure whether the old man had slipped into senility. Hadn't he just said to let them all go? So he sent for his father and asked him to join him at Caudium. When the old man arrived, he told his son that he still retained his senses, and neither message had been a mistake. The best option, by far, he said, was to spare the army and return them unharmed to Rome, for in doing so they would win the eternal friendship and gratitude of the Roman people, and hostilities would end forever. The second best option was to kill them all, and end hostilities for at least a generation, by decimating Rome's available manpower and filling the Roman populace with terror of the Samnites. There are no other options, the old man said. Extreme generosity or extreme cruelty. That was it. But Pontius was unnerved by both, and settled on a third option that his father warned him, correctly, would win him no friends and eliminate no enemies. He would let the army go, but force them to surrender under the yoke, a humiliating ritual in which the defeated army must pass beneath a horizontal spear lashed to 2 vertical spears, creating a gate of sorts that the soldiers had to stoop to pass beneath. To the honor-crazed armies of the ancient world, this humiliation was far worse than being killed on the battlefield. Far, far worse. And to the men who surrendered at Caudine, their humiliation would be doubled, because they had never even drawn their swords. They were never given the opportunity to die gloriously in battle and take as many Samnites as they could with them. It was absolutely unheard of to give up without a fight, and the thought of it mortally offended every soldier in the army, but their orders were clear, and pass under the yoke they did. The army that marched back to Rome was unlike any that had gone before it or would come after. They marched weaponless and in complete silence, walking and eating without saying a word or even looking up from the ground. Some said that the Samnites had defeated the spirit of Rome itself, but savvy observers warned that this was unlikely, that the silent army was not devoid of spirit, but merely smoldering with such an intense rage that words could not express their emotions. And woe to those upon whom Rome's fury would be unleashed. The terms of the peace also called for 600 cavalrymen, i.e., the sons of the richest men in Rome, to be held as hostages, as well as for the consuls and their officers to become guarantors of the peace, an official, half-religious, half-legal position in ancient international diplomacy. In effect, it meant that upon their return to Rome, they must force the Senate and people to accept the terms of peace offered at the battlefield. If they did not, the gods would punish Rome as a whole if the guarantors who were in breach of their duty did not hand themselves back over to the Samnites, who would sell them as slaves. This threat was supposed to be enough to compel even unhappy guarantors to do their duty, and it usually was. But, like I say, the Romans were cut from a completely different cloth. It is unclear at what point Postumius, one of the consuls, decided to breach the trust, whether it was his plan all along, or whether he decided to do so after reaching Rome. But when he stood before the Senate and delivered the official account of events leading up to the surrender and the terms of the peace, he urged them not to accept, but reject the Samnites' offer and immediately re-raise the army and attack. He and his colleagues had been foolish, but that did not mean Rome itself should admit defeat. Further, he said, he and his officers would immediately march back to where Pontius waited for word and surrender themselves, releasing Rome from its obligation to honor the terms of the treaty. The Senate, who had been ready to castigate Postumius and his colleague in the harshest terms, now praised them to the heavens. The two consuls and their officers, a priest in tow to witness the whole thing, returned to the Samnite army and surrendered themselves, announcing that Rome rejected peace and did so with the full favor of the gods. Pontius was incensed and refused to accept the surrender, claiming that the sneaky Romans were just trying to weasel their way out of defeat with a legalistic reading of the pact. No one who swore to be a guarantor abandoned his duty and thought that just by surrendering himself he had absolved his nation of guilt. It was outrageous, but there Postumius stood doing exactly that. If Rome wanted to play chicken with the gods, that was fine with Pontius, and ordered his men to let Postumius and his officers walk away unmolested, so the offer of surrender would never be accepted, and the pact, at least from the Samnite perspective, would remain in breach. How much of this story is propaganda and how much is true is up in the air. There is no doubt, though, that following the defeat at the Caudine Forks, there was a 5-year lull in hostilities. It seems reasonable that the 5 years of peace was somehow related to the terms of the surrender, but according to the Romans, they never recognized any peace and were free and clear to continue fighting if they wished. I suspect that the story of Postumius' surrender is overblown. It mirrors closely a story from the First Punic War, in which a captured general is returned to Rome to secure a peace treaty, but instead tells the Senate to keep fighting and then honorably returns to Carthage, where the promise of torture and death await him. But even if the Romans had believed they could keep fighting, unbound by any treaty, that did not mean that they would necessarily have wanted to. Caudine Forks had been a humiliation, that much is certain, and the Romans would have had no interest in allowing history to repeat itself. Perhaps the 5-year layoff was simply Rome being cautious. Clearly the Samnites were more clever than they had been given credit for. There was no sense in giving them the opportunity to crush Rome's dreams of empire so soon after they had been fully, consciously articulated. The Romans would bide their time. Patience was another great Roman virtue. They were in no hurry. They just wanted to be sure of victory. Most likely, though, a 5-year peace was forced on the Romans, who had no choice but to submit to the Samnite terms, and no such episode of bold defiance ever occurred. Next week, we will pick up when hostilities begin again, around 315 BC. At that point, the Etruscans in the north and the Greeks in the south would both become involved as well, leading the fight between the Romans and Samnites to become a struggle that embroiled all the major powers in Italy. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. The Romans licked their wounds, or perhaps more accurately, nursed their egos, after the defeat at Caudine Forks in 321 BC. 5 years passed with the Romans engaging their neighbors in minor skirmishes, but avoiding another major confrontation with the Samnites. Whether this was because of an official peace treaty or out of Roman fear is still unclear, but whatever the cause, there was a break in the fighting. All that changed in 316 BC, however, when the Romans, confident once again, marched out and attempted again to conquer the Samnites. This second stage of the war started out no better for the Romans than the first had ended, though. But they soon gained the upper hand, and after 10 years of hard fighting, the Romans would force the Samnites to submit in 304 BC. In the race to victory, the Romans stumbled out of the gates. In 315 BC, they met the Samnites near Laudale, and were defeated in convincing fashion. Details of the battle are sketchy, but it appears certain that the dictator commanding the Roman legion was killed in the fighting. Rome's power was now on the verge of completely unraveling. They had lost a major battle at Caudine without a fight, and now, on their big comeback tour, when they actually took the field against the Samnites, they were soundly beaten. Things were not looking good for the Romans. Campania, the territory over which Rome and Samnium had originally clashed, was perilously close to abandoning their treaty with Rome, so recently entered into, and giving themselves over to the Samnites. Tarentum, a major Greek city in the south, had already declared for the Samnites, and now negotiations had begun to bring the Etruscans into the fray. However, the Etruscans bought high on Samnite power, and when they did enter the war, found themselves overmatched by a newly resurgent Rome. It was during these years that the Romans began to radically alter the legion's organization and tactics, switching from the clunky phalanx into the maneuverable three-line maniple system. Once the structural deficiencies of their army were ironed out, Rome's advantage in wealth and manpower left little doubt as to the final outcome of the war. One of the ways that wealth manifested itself as an aid to the war effort was in an infrastructure project that survives today, a living monument to Roman engineering genius, the Via Appia, or Appian Way. During the First Samnite War, though they emerged victorious, the Romans struggled constantly to move troops and supplies south into Campania and Samnium in anything resembling quick time. Wet, marshy land separated the 2 points, literally bogging down efforts. Roads through the foothills above were too hazardous, and the only other route was a long, arduous trip along the coast. The Romans needed a way to get into Campania quickly, and began to entertain the idea of building a straight road linking Rome and Capua, the capital city of Campania. The proposals never got off the ground, as resources were tied up first with the Latin War, then again with the Samnites, but in 312 BC, a man came forward with the vision and will to accomplish the goal. Appius Claudius, whose name was attached to the road for his efforts, was a member in good standing of one of the more controversial families in Rome, the Claudi. Implacable foes of the Publians, the Claudi never lacked for enemies. Indeed, it had been another Appius Claudius who had headed the Decemviri in its efforts to consolidate power after compiling the 12 Tables of Law around 450 BC. But the Appius Claudius of whom we speak today outdid them all in pomposity and pretensions to infallibility. He remains himself one of the more interesting and infamous figures in Roman history, both the driving force behind some of the most ambitious public works projects in history, and a man who seemed coolly untroubled by his own thrashing of constitutional and religious precedents. Claudius was elected censor, an office of enormous importance, in 312 BC, along with a colleague. One of the critical functions of the censors at this point was to declare who was eligible for the Senate and who was eligible to vote. Claudius, rather than simply following the previous year's rolls, as was the custom, decided to drastically alter the composition of the Senate and the electorate, expelling members he considered his enemies and enrolling men who promised him loyalty. Aghast, his colleague resigned, knowing that if he did so, Claudius would be stopped, because any time one censor died or resigned, the other stepped down so 2 fresh censors could stand in their place. But Claudius refused to step down, sparking a minor constitutional crisis. The manipulated Senate, however, made of senators who owed their office to Claudius, predictably remained silent. Despite calls for his head, Claudius remained in office. He then further infuriated public opinion by taking certain sacred rights away from a family he disapproved of and passing them into the hands of public slaves. For this offense, Claudius was allegedly struck blind by the gods, though accounts of his eyesight loss do not crop up until later in the annals, and then seem to only describe his final days as old blind Claudius declaring Rome's determined opposition to Pyrrhus's invasion. In any event, blind or not, Claudius set to work on his pet projects, 2 of which stood foremost in his mind: the road to Capua, which would bear his name, and a series of aqueducts that would guarantee a fresh water supply for Rome, which would also bear his name. The Romans had finally accepted Claudius as single censor, and even applauded his lead in the public works, but he set off a fresh firestorm when his term of office expired after 18 months. He shocked everyone by declaring that he would not be stepping down. Rome was aghast at this sacrilege. He had sworn an oath to step down, and now flouted it with all the hubris of a Greek tragic hero. In the end, Claudius would remain censor for 5 unprecedented years, generally upsetting constitutional purists, but endearing himself to the people with his liberal dispensations from the treasury, the obvious benefits of his projects, and his policies of enfranchisement, for he extended the vote to landless citizens who otherwise had no voice at all. He proved sufficiently popular that when he stepped down, he immediately won election as consul. In later years, the scandals of Appius Claudius were largely forgotten, and he was remembered first and foremost as the man who gave the Romans their most important road and their most important network of aqueducts. The Appian Way, after it had served its immediate military purpose, would evolve into the main artery of travel and trade for the Romans, eventually stretching over 500 miles southeast across the peninsula. Equipped with their new road, made of stone, bowed to prevent water collection, and supported by retaining walls, the Romans were now able to keep their troops in Samnium far better supplied than before, and the war began to slowly turn against the Samnites. The Roman strategy was straightforward, though it took years to see it through to the end. The Samnites, unlike their neighbors in the lowlands, did not concentrate in large cities, and as a result, there was no one place the Romans could target to bring a swift conclusion to hostilities. They had to proceed piecemeal, cutting off Samnite communities from each other by holding the mountain passes and building fortresses along navigable rivers. Once an area was secure, the Romans could move on, at all times doing their best to cut off supply routes and access to summer or winter pasture land, and so disrupt the entire Samnite way of life. In this way, the Romans slowly hemmed in the Samnites and annexed more and more of their territory, sending in colonists and taking possession of Samnium bit by little bit. The Samnites, however, were not the only enemy the Romans now faced. The Etruscans, mustering what solidarity they could, rose up in arms in 311 BC and opened a whole new theater of operations. Each year the Romans designated one of their consuls to handle operations in Samnium, while the other went north to Etruria. It speaks volumes of the manpower and wealth available to Rome that they were able to run wars on two completely separate fronts and emerge victorious from both. The Romans were in the driver's seat for most of the decade, with the Senate truly gripped by panic only once, in 310 BC, and even then it was a panic from a lack of information rather than from any true danger. In the north, the consul in charge, former insubordinate master of horse Quintus Fabius, went off the radar for a while. He had defeated an Etruscan army, and the survivors had fled into the Ciminian forest, a dense, roadless, wooded area which was off limits to the superstitious Romans. But Fabius decided reports about rodents of unusual size lurking in the forest were overblown and took his army in, pursuing the fleeing Etruscan army. He was out of contact for some time, which would have been a cause for concern, but not alarm, had not his colleague in Samnium been wounded in battle at the same time. The Senate, back in Rome, received word that one consul was injured, who knew how badly, and the other had led his army into the nightmare woods of the Ciminian forest and began to panic. In point of fact, though, the consul in Samnium recovered from his minor injuries quickly, and Quintus Fabius was actually in the process of securing an alliance with the people who dwelled inside the Ciminian. But the Senate knew none of this. Papirius Cursor, the man who had ordered the execution of young Fabius, was appointed dictator by the panicky Senate and led an army of fresh recruits into Etruria to track down the lost legions. When he arrived, Fabius had already emerged from the woods, new allies in tow. He was surprised and horrified to find that his command had been given to Papirius, whom he understandably bore some resentment over the drama a few years earlier. But he submitted to the Senate's will and allowed Papirius to take command. Together they led their combined army against the regrouped Etruscans near Lake Vadimo. The resulting battle was the only clash with the Etruscans that was ever in doubt. All three Roman lines became involved, and the tide did not turn until late in the day. The Etruscans, however, eventually broke and fled. They never again caused the Romans serious trouble, surrendering in 308 BC, leaving the Samnites to carry on alone. The Samnites were now in desperate straits. They were having difficulty with their supply lines, their armies could not link up with one another, they were constantly outnumbered, and their communities were beginning to suffer terribly under what was, in essence, a massive siege, not of a city, but of an entire territory. The Samnites held on as long as they could, but finally, reluctantly, sued for peace in 304 BC, bringing an end to the Second Samnite War. They had lost a great deal of their territory, and the Romans had founded 13 colonies in and around Samnium. In the north, the Romans had pushed deep into Etruscan territory, and either controlled by arms or alliance most of what had once been the most powerful confederation in Italy. Roman garrisons settled in across the peninsula, leaving only the Greek-controlled south untouched by Roman power. The Second Samnite War had been an incredibly transformative period of time. Italy had gone from being a land of fractured and competing sovereigns to a land under the control of a single dominant power. Roman citizenship was extended in its various gradient forms to tribes across the peninsula, who recognized more and more that their future prosperity would be determined by their relationship with Rome. And though the Romans were of course resisted, and at this point their domination was by no means complete, as many as fought simply acquiesced and welcomed the Romans with open arms. As I noted previously, the Romans treated those who submitted without a fight with amazing generosity, giving them full access to Roman prosperity. Though they gave up their sovereignty and were required to submit soldiers for the legions, they received their fair share of the spoils and were allowed, as was standard Roman practice, a great deal of latitude in their own local rule. The Romans themselves also changed. Obviously, the makeup of the legions was now radically different than it had been, with its strategy, tactics, and organization completely overhauled. But the completion of the Appian Way and the aqueducts, so impressive in their scope and so well conceived in their construction, that it signaled a change in the Romans as a whole, as they began to outpace their contemporaries in terms of their level of civilization. Rome, in short, was becoming the Rome we think of and remember today. The Rome that keeps us fascinated 1,500 years after the fall of their empire. The Samnites, however, were not done yet. After 10 years of peace, they realized that any treaty with Rome meant effectively an end to their independence forever. Rome was moving inexorably in the direction of imperial master, not simply powerful neighbor. In a last, desperate play for general Italian independence, the Samnites organized and led a coalition that included the Etruscans, the Umbrians, and even the Gauls against Roman power. Next week, we will cover the resulting conflict, known as the Third Samnite War, though the name is a bit of a misnomer. It was not simply Rome against the Samnites, but Rome against everyone. And in this war against everyone, Rome would win, and everyone else would lose. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. As the 300s gave way to the 200s BC, Rome found itself the de facto master of Italy. It was not yet official, but for all intents and purposes, Italy belonged to Rome. Certainly the Romans saw themselves as being in charge, and their actions in the immediate aftermath of the long Second Samnite War demonstrated this. But in the volatile ancient world, a beaten enemy one year was often victorious the next, so though Rome was surrounded by beaten enemies, next year was just around the corner. Rome's attitude towards the fiercely independent Samnites and once regal Etruscans led to smoldering resentment across Rome's new territory, which, I suppose, was the source of their resentment, Rome considering Etruria and Samnium to be newly conquered territory ripe for settlement and colonization, while the natives saw their treaties with Rome as being between equals. Unequal terms, yes, but between equals. When Rome started planning colonies in Samnium and parading the legions through Etruria, a fresh talk of resistance and war began again. The Samnites in particular understood that Rome was now driven by visions of a peninsula-wide empire, and peace meant little more than death by population migration and displacement, rather than by a sword to the head. They were proud of their culture and language and way of life, and saw all too well what the future held for a passive Samnite nation, a mere footnote in Roman history books. At least if they fought, they could be the subjects of one more podcast episode. In 298 BC, the Samnites began to resist Roman incursions into their land. Rome sent envoys to Samnium to demand that the treaty of peace be honored, but the Samnites were done with the treaty, and war was declared once again. Two consular armies, two armies under the command of a consul, so 4 total legions, were sent into Samnium in 297 BC. The Samnites were unprepared for this onslaught, and the army they had raised did its level best to stay away from the Romans, not wanting to risk a full-scale battle that they would surely lose. So the consuls, Marcus Valerius, no longer the intemperate young master of horse, but by now an old man and widely considered to be the most able of all the Roman generals, and Publius Decius, son of the legendary Decius, who won the grass crown and sacrificed himself in battle, spent the year ransacking the countryside. Eventually the Samnite army, still unwilling to fight in the open, left Samnium altogether and made its way to Etruria. They knew they could never defeat the Romans alone. They needed help. The next year, Appius Claudius, he of the Appian Way, was elected consul again. The people wanted to return Marcus Valerius as consul for the second year in a row, but he begged off, citing the mandatory decade wait before holding office again, scolding the Romans for attempting to abandon the rule of law just because they were faced with an emergency. Chastened, the electorate re-voted and elected instead a plebeian named Lucius Volumnius. When the Etruscans began to rise up as well, the two new consuls drew lots to determine their spheres of command. Volumnius was assigned Samnium, while Claudius drew Etruria. When Volumnius arrived in Samnium, he found that its army remained in semi-exile. He marched around, capturing towns, raiding for plunder, generally enriching himself and his men with ease. But he knew that there was no threat to Rome to be found amongst the women and children and old men of Samnium. Rome's enemies were in Etruria, he thought. What in the world am I doing here? At this point, a discrepancy in the record emerges. According to Volumnius, Claudius sent him a distress letter confirming his fears, stating that the Etruscans and Samnite armies had joined forces, and Volumnius must come to Etruria at once to help. Volumnius, seeing no danger in leaving Samnium, marched his legions north to Etruria to answer Claudius's call for help. When he arrived, however, Claudius denied having ever written such a letter. Claudius said that he was well in command of the situation and did not need Volumnius around trying to horn in on his glory. It was not explicit, but the implication was that the patrician Claudius did not need the assistance of a mere plebeian. Volumnius, offended by the reaction to what he thought was requested aid, said, "Fine, have it your way," and wheeled his army around. But the officers and men of Claudius's army blocked his path. Despite the vain assertions of their commander, they told Volumnius that the situation in Etruria was dire, and the presence of both armies was necessary for victory. Volumnius decided to put it to a vote of the legions, who, by loud acclaim, demanded he stay. Claudius was nonplussed, but was a savvy enough politician not to fly in the face of resounding popular opinion, and agreed to fight with Volumnius by his side. The united legions then rushed out to find the mixed Etruscan and Samnite army. The resulting battle was an ill-organized and sloppy affair on both sides. The general of the Samnites wasn't even present, so the Samnites were completely disorganized in their deployment, and the Roman legions, with their commanders at odds with one another and hasty in their search for a fight, just charged into the fray without any plan at all. But in spite of this, the Romans prevailed, scattering the Etruscans and leaving the Samnite army in disarray. However, this victory did not end the danger. The next year, 295, the Samnite army regrouped and the Etruscan communities committed fresh troops to the struggle. In addition, the Umbrians, a hill tribe from the northern Apennines, officially joined the coalition against the Romans, and, in a surprise development, Gallic tribes that had settled in the Po Valley allowed their services to be bought by the rich Etruscans, swelling the size and strength of the army Rome would soon face. The armies of these 4 races gathered near Clusium in northern Etruria to plan their next move. In Rome, consular elections were held, and despite his renewed protests, Marcus Valerius was returned once again. This time he bowed to public pressure and agreed to serve. His only stipulation was that Publius Decius be made his colleague. The two had been partners in the consulship twice before, and had served together as censors. There were obvious tactical disadvantages to having consuls at odds with one another, as Claudius and Volumnius had proven, and Marcus Valerius wanted to make sure that there was harmony at the top as Rome went off to challenge the largest and most dangerous enemy it had ever faced. The people agreed with this logic and returned Decius. However, despite their previous excellent working relationship, things immediately got off on the wrong foot. The Senate wanted to assign Marcus Valerius to Etruria without the traditional drawing of lots. Decius protested, saying that he had no problem being sent to Samnium to lead the war on a quiet front, but he would not do so arbitrarily because Marcus Valerius, a patrician, was considered better suited for the greater danger that lay in Etruria. He demanded that lots be drawn and let the chips fall where they may. Marcus Valerius, for his part, exacerbated the situation by accepting command in Etruria and, in fact, claiming it as his right. If it had not been for his bold decision to enter the Cimmerian forest and secure the natives as allies of Rome, the legions would not have the supply routes needed to enable a major campaign in Etruria in the first place. He considered Etruria to be his country, and wanted to finish the job he had started. A heated exchange of words followed, but in the end, precedent gave way to popular pressure, and Marcus Valerius led his legions into Etruria without lots being drawn. However, after the Senate began to read Marcus Valerius's reports of the massive army gathering, and hearing Appius Claudius describe the desperate situation he had just left, they recalled Decius from Samnium and asked him to join Valerius in Etruria. Every enemy of Rome was gathered in the north, and the Romans absolutely, positively had to win the upcoming battle if they were to have any peace at all in the future. So Decius marched with his armies north, leaving a token force to watch over the non-combatant Samnites. Marcus Valerius was a far more practical man than Claudius, and when he saw Decius approaching, he welcomed him with open arms. Glory could only be had in victory, and the size of the anti-Roman coalition army was drastically reducing the odds of victory. But joined together, the legions would be more than a match for this formidable enemy. The two armies met near Sentinum and set up camp across from one another on a plain. Deserters from the Gallic camp brought the consuls word of the coalition's plan. They had decided that the Gauls and Samnites would fight Rome on the battlefield, while the Etruscans and Umbrians overwhelmed the undermanned Roman camp. They hoped to catch the Romans without an exit strategy and crush them between the force of their four combined armies. But, now knowing the plan, the consuls immediately took measures to prevent its implementation. In a classic display of indirect strategy, a contingent of legionaries was ordered out into the Etruscan countryside to attack and burn at will any house, community, town, or field they encountered. This devastation could not be tolerated by the Etruscans, who broke camp and made off to protect their homes. Having now peeled off at least a fourth of the opposing forces and throwing a wrench in the coalition plan, the Romans immediately sought a battle, which the remaining Samnites, Umbrians, and Gauls welcomed, abandoning their dual attack strategy for one all-out attack. They were confident of victory. Today would be the day they broke Rome and lifted its oppressive yoke from the back of Italy. That was the plan, anyway. The Battle of Sentinum was the largest ever fought in Italy to that date. Both sides fielded armies upwards of 40,000 men, with allies and cavalry included. On the Roman side, Decius commanded the left flank against the Gauls, while Marcus Valerius took the right against the Samnites. Though united in purpose, they took very different approaches. Valerius felt that Rome's strength lay in its discipline and endurance, that the Gauls and Samnites started strong but faded down the stretch. He took a conservative approach, holding against Samnite rushes, but not pressing the advantage or taking risks. Once they tired, though, he planned on crushing them. Decius, however, the junior partner, had no such patience. He wanted to meet strength with strength and push back with everything he had against the Gauls. When they began to falter, Decius decided to win the battle early and decisively, but in his haste for glory, he sealed his own fate. He led a bold cavalry charge into the heart of the Gallic line, but, rather than breaking them, he found his own forces scattered and killed, and when the cavalry wheeled around to escape the Gallic attack, they charged headlong into the front lines of the Roman infantry, crushing under hoof many of their own men. The Roman left was in complete disarray and began to panic and flee. Decius, however, recognizing his folly, and here we are moving into romantic, vivid Roman storytelling, knew what he had to do. He called a priest and declared that as his father had sacrificed himself to ensure victory, so too would he, to atone for his folly. He anointed himself and, wrapped in a ceremonial robe, followed his father into the underworld. Seeing their commander's sacrifice, the Roman left rallied and charged the Gauls. On the right, Marcus Valerius's plan was about to come to fruition. He saw that the spears were thrown with a little less force and a little more aimlessly. He ordered his cavalry in middle line around to the right and pressed the Samnite flank. When they turned, Valerius ordered his main line to charge ahead and take no prisoners. The Samnites could not long endure the dual front, and finally, after a full day's fighting, they broke and fled. The Gauls, along with the Umbrian forces, were now pinned between two armies, and, recognizing the fight was lost, followed the Samnites into the Etruscan countryside. The Romans had faced a combined army of the four strongest tribes in Italy and emerged victorious. The peninsula was now Rome's, and would remain so for the next 800 years. The war against the Samnites would carry on for another 5 years, but at Sentinum the fate of Italy was sealed. A final clash between the Romans and Samnites was fought at Aquilonia in 293 BC, with the Romans completely dominating an enemy that had once been more than equal to Roman strength. The Samnites were beaten, finally and completely, and the 5 decades-long struggle came to an end. But though they could no longer muster the force necessary to resist Roman domination, Samnite resentment never died. 200 years later, the Samnites would be at the center of the Social War, an Italian revolt against Roman discrimination. In that war, they were the first to take the field and the last to surrender. But that story is for another day. Next week we will turn our attention south. The new Roman dream of an Italian empire was fast becoming a reality, and the only thing that stood in their way now was the Greek cities of Magna Graecia. The time had come for the independent city-states in the south to recognize a new master, though subduing the Greeks would be no easy task. They were as skilled at war as the Romans and had the resources of Greece to support them in their struggle, and one general in particular, Pyrrhus of Epirus, a relative of Alexander the Great, to lead them. Greece was fresh off conquering half the world under Alexander and was the premier civilization of its day. This would be the first in a series of clashes between the upstart Romans and the long-established Greeks that would mark the transition from Greek to Roman dominance in the Mediterranean. Though when Pyrrhus climbed aboard his ship to sail for Italy, he knew none of this. He thought he was off to put down some barbaric rabble and maybe get rich, but he had no idea what he was up against. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. After defeating the Etruscans in the north and the Samnites in the east, the Romans now looked to Magna Graecia in the south for fresh conquests. All that stood between Rome and an Italian-wide empire was the fiercely independent and disunited Greek cities. Despite the collective threat they faced from Rome, the rivalry between the cities of Magna Graecia precluded any organized resistance. The Romans decided all they had to do was play the cities off one another, knowing they would have little trouble finding a few willing Greek accomplices who, in return for preferential treatment from their new Roman overlords, would aid Rome in subduing their Greek countrymen. But Roman plans were complicated by the introduction of an army from across the Adriatic, led by the Greek king Pyrrhus. Answering calls for aid against the Romans, Pyrrhus had dreams of an Italian kingdom for himself, and though his dreams were ultimately foiled, the battles he fought against the Romans marked the opening salvo in a struggle between the Roman West and the Greek East that would end 100 years later with a bewildered Greek nation kneeling before their new Roman masters. Prior to the invasion by Pyrrhus, the eastern and western Mediterranean had, for the most part, been completely separate from one another. Divided roughly by the Adriatic and Ionian seas, the two halves had, politically at least, developed independently. Greek attention had always faced east and been consumed by its rivalry with Persia when it wasn't consumed with battling endlessly within itself. There were, of course, Greeks who had migrated west to the south of Italy and Sicily, but once their cities were founded, it was like they lived in a different world. There was no attempt from the motherland to control them, and no involvement by the Italian colonies in persistent internal Greek squabbles. The only major historical overlap was the Athenian invasion of Sicily during the Peloponnesian War in 415 BC. The expedition had ended so disastrously for the Athenians, many point to it as the principal reason Athens ultimately lost that war, that the thought of going west filled the Greeks with prudent revulsion for generations. They had enough to deal with in the east without courting disaster in the west. When Alexander ascended to the throne in 338 BC, all of his ambition lay east with the conquest of Persia and beyond. It has long been a source of speculation how different things would have turned out had Alexander turned west and faced the nascent Roman Empire rather than going east to fight the Persians. It was only 650 miles from Athens to Rome, and Alexander, who marched 3,000 miles to India undefeated, could have taken Italy almost as an afterthought. But the Romans were granted a stay of execution, and the greatest general in the ancient world marched his armies east, all the way to India, allowing Rome to continue to gather its strength unmolested. 40 years of war, shifting alliances, and rivalries between Alexander's generals had followed his death in 323 BC. But by 280, things had fairly well settled themselves, so that when a Greek commander finally did look west with ambition, it was only because of the limited opportunities for conquest in the post-Alexandrian eastern Mediterranean. That commander, Pyrrhus of Epirus, was born in 318 BC, right into the middle of the post-Alexandrian struggle. He was a prince of Epirus, a kingdom located in what is today the Balkans, on the periphery of the Greek world. He was a second cousin of Alexander and found himself caught up in the volatile post-Alexandrian battles for control of Greece, Egypt, and Persia. His father was dethroned when Pyrrhus was only 2, and the family was forced into exile. At 16, his father now dead, Pyrrhus was returned to the throne of Epirus by the powerful king his family had taken refuge with, but a year later he was deposed. Through marriage, Pyrrhus managed to gain some powerful friends while enduring his second exile. Taking a daughter of Ptolemy as his wife, and marrying his sister to Demetrius, the reigning king of Macedon. With these new allies, Pyrrhus regained the throne of Epirus. A few years later, his sister dead, Pyrrhus turned on his ex-brother-in-law, conquering Macedon and proclaiming himself king. His reign over Alexander's homeland was brief, however, and he was driven back to Epirus in 284 BC. By this time, the situation in the east had begun to solidify. What had once been Alexander's empire was now divided into 3 major kingdoms: Antigonid Greece and Macedon, Seleucid Persia and Asia Minor, and Ptolemaic Egypt. There was little room here for an ambitious 34-year-old leader of a minor Greek kingdom. When then, in 282 BC, Tarentum, one of the leading cities of Magna Graecia, sent envoys into Greece begging for aid against Roman encroachment, Pyrrhus leapt at the opportunity. The major powers disdained to get involved, but Pyrrhus saw a chance for glory. There may not be room for him in the east, but there was abundant space for a savvy general to acquire a rich and powerful empire in the west. Pyrrhus nobly answered the call for aid and readied his army of 25,000 to sail to the rescue of his besieged countrymen, who would soon, hopefully, also be his subjects. Tarentum had run afoul of Rome, because Rome had run afoul of Tarentum. The Romans had formed an alliance with the minor city of Thurii, and when their new allies were threatened, Rome offered assistance. This annoyed the Tarentines, who considered internal Greek matters to be their domain. They were further incensed when a small Roman fleet sent to garrison Thurii was blown off course and ended up in Tarentine waters, a clear violation of a standing treaty between Rome and Tarentum. The Tarentines attacked the Roman fleet and sunk a number of the errant ships. So now it was Rome's turn to be incensed, and envoys were sent to Tarentum to demand an apology. The Tarentines, however, greeted the envoys rudely and sent them packing to a chorus of insults. Rome needed no further provocation, and in 282 BC, war was immediately declared. Before aid could arrive from Greece, though, the Romans sacked Tarentum and had begun negotiations of peace with its aristocratic party, who favored an alliance with Rome. An advance party from Epirus, however, arrived in 281 BC, just as the papers were being signed, and drove the Romans out. In 280, Pyrrhus arrived with his full army, including 4,000 cavalry and 20 war elephants. They landed in Italy without opposition, and the Greek king began to lay plans for the systematic conquest of the peninsula. But the Romans, who had just recently secured Italy for themselves, were in no mood to give it up easily. The Romans sent an army 8 legions strong south to deal with this invading army, and met Pyrrhus near Heraclea, a Greek city located on the instep of the Italian boot. Pyrrhus was confident of victory, but began to have doubts as he watched the Romans methodically build their fortified camps. This was not the barbarian horde the Tarentines had described. It was an organized and disciplined army of a civilized society. Mildly worried, but undeterred, Pyrrhus led his army out into the field. The disciplined Greek phalanx was more than a match for the Romans, and Pyrrhus's army soon gained the upper hand. But the Romans were stubborn in defeat, and the battle took its toll on the Greek army. Pyrrhus lost 4,000 of his best troops, and watched with consternation as the Romans, far from breaking and fleeing in panic, withdrew in an orderly fashion back to their camp. This was not going to be as easy as he thought. The Battle of Heraclea was important for 2 reasons. First, it was the first time the newly reformed Manipal legions had faced the might of a full Greek phalanx. True, the legions had lost, but the fight was by no means lopsided. Second, it was also the first time the Romans faced war elephants. The Roman cavalry was terrified by the huge beasts, and the presence of the elephants played a major role in tipping the battle in Pyrrhus's favor. The Romans would learn from their defeat and craft new ways to attack the phalanx and tactics to deal with the hitherto unknown elephant. Tactics that would come into play when Hannibal deployed them time and again against the Romans in the Second Punic War. The Romans next met Pyrrhus further north at Asculum, on the east side of the Apennines. By this time, Pyrrhus had reinforced himself with some new Italian allies, most notably a collection of Samnite tribes. But the Greek king was disappointed by his inability to peel off more Italian allies from Rome. The Romans had done much to shore up their alliances, and Pyrrhus's plan of turning the Italians en masse against Rome was not coming to fruition easily. When the two sides met near Asculum, they fielded equal armies of about 40,000. The Romans were led by Publius Decius, son of the hero of the Third Samnite War, and grandson of the hero of the First Samnite War, who brought with him new devices to deal with the war elephants, including chariots that would circle the legs of the huge beasts with rope and bring them crashing down. It was the same tactic that had served the rebel alliance so well against the imperial walkers during the battle for Hoth. The first day of the battle ended in a stalemate. The Greek forces broke the legions they faced on the left wing, but the Romans defeated the Samnite and Tarentine forces in the center. Pyrrhus tried to press his advantage on the wing, but the beaten Romans retreated up a steep hill, too steep for the Greek phalanx to follow. Raining projectiles down, the Romans forced Pyrrhus to withdraw, and the day ended with neither side holding the advantage. The next day, Pyrrhus ordered his men to hold the steep ground, and they forced the Romans into the flat, open plain. This time, his elephants overwhelmed the Roman line, and they broke. Pyrrhus had won again, but the battle had been costly, and many of his best officers had fallen. Congratulated on his triumph, Pyrrhus famously commented, "One more such victory, and we are undone," giving rise to the expression Pyrrhic Victory to describe a costly success. Worn down by fighting the Romans, Pyrrhus offered terms of peace, but was rebuffed by the Roman Senate. They were persuaded by the old, and by now truly blind, Appius Claudius, to deny any treaty with a foreign army while it remained on Italian soil. At this point, Pyrrhus was in quite a bind, for the Romans had just concluded a new treaty with the Carthaginians, and now the true great powers of the western Mediterranean would not be turned against one another. So Pyrrhus decided to move on from Italy. It had, after all, been his plan all along to use Italian bases as a springboard for the real prize, Sicily. He was allowing himself to get bogged down with preliminary and unnecessary fighting. He did not need the Italian bases, they just would have been nice. His ego-saving rationalizations thus complete, Pyrrhus left Italy and sailed for Sicily in 278 BC. At this point, Sicily was divided between the Carthaginians, who held the west, and the Greeks, who held the east. Upon hearing the news of Pyrrhus's imminent invasion, the Carthaginians laid siege to Syracuse, the most important Greek city on the island, and attempted to capture it before Pyrrhus arrived. But they were unsuccessful and were driven off when Pyrrhus landed. The Greek king claimed Syracuse as his own and led the grateful Greeks against the Carthaginians, who were pressed back until they held a single city on the west coast. The Carthaginians offered to relinquish claims to the rest of Sicily as long as they were allowed to hold the one port, but Pyrrhus, confident in final victory, refused the offer. But unable to dislodge the Carthaginians from their stronghold, he decided to attack the North African mother city directly. He ordered the Sicilians to raise an army and build him a fleet for the invasion. But the locals had by this time grown tired of Pyrrhus's dictatorial style and refused. The strength of his army sapped by the campaigns in Italy and Sicily, and his rearguard pressed hard by the Romans, Pyrrhus decided to return to the mainland lest he find himself trapped on the island by the Carthaginian fleet. He would consolidate his holdings in Italy and return to Sicily with a large enough army to drive out the Carthaginians once and for all. So in 275 BC, he returned to Italy and immediately faced a Roman army determined to drive the Greek invader off. They faced each other near Maleventum, and, once again, Pyrrhus's army defeated the legions, but this time, Roman fire arrows had sent the war elephants crashing through Pyrrhus's own line, wreaking havoc and killing a good chunk of his infantry. By now the casualties had mounted up, and Pyrrhus, at his wits' end, decided he had had enough of Italy. He gathered up what was left of his army and sailed back to Epirus. Never had a general won so many battles with so little to show for it. The Romans, delighting in their non-victory victory, renamed Maleventum Beneventum, changing it from the place of bad events to the place of good events. Pyrrhus left behind a garrison in Tarentum, but the Romans quickly overran the outnumbered Greeks and in short order had solidified their hold on Magna Graecia. The Romans now controlled the entire peninsula and had proven themselves to be an emerging power in pan-Mediterranean politics. The East began to wake up to the threat that was rising from Italy. As long as the Romans were confined to the peninsula, the balance of power that had settled in the post-Alexandrian world would hold. But if this new Roman force, which had just driven off a more than able Greek army, led by a man widely considered to be the best general of his generation, decided to expand its horizons, it spelled nothing but trouble for the old powers. The Roman capture of Magna Graecia represented not just another step in Roman expansion, it also effectively brought to a close the era of the city-state in the ancient world. The polity that Plato and Aristotle had held as the ideal form of government was now a thing of the past. The Macedonian conquest of Greece had already ended forever the existence of the independent city-state there, but it had survived in the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia. Now, though, the subjugation by Rome ended any official autonomy for the Greek city-states of Italy, and henceforth politics and government in the ancient world would move permanently into the hands of large empires. The only true holdout was Syracuse, which managed to survive more or less independently until the end of the Second Punic War, but its longevity was only secured by a close personal alliance between Hiero, the king of Syracuse, and Rome. Had Hiero been less of a friend to Rome, Syracuse would have fallen long before it did. The city-state as a political institution was effectively dead, and Rome had dealt the killing stroke. As for Pyrrhus, he never got the chance to avenge his losses in Italy, and was allegedly killed in 272 BC while fighting in the Greek city of Argos by a tile thrown from a rooftop by an Argead woman. He never won the empire he sought, and his main legacy lay in teaching the Romans how to effectively battle a Greek army and introducing them to war elephants. The Romans, always adapting their techniques, would apply what they'd learned 100 years later when they again met the Greeks in battle. Though the tables would be turned the next time they met, and it would be the Greeks' turn to lose to an invading Roman army, though the Roman victories were far from Pyrrhic, and Greece was conquered easily.